In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, a locked-room murder shocks all. A grumpy colonel shot dead with no one nearby. Was it greed, revenge, or pure chance? Join Miss Jane Marple as she unravels secrets from a stopped clock to a whiff of lavender, proving that no motive can hide from her sharp eyes. Dive into this cozy mystery where wisdom solves the darkest crimes.
Chapter 1. The Village Gathering and an Ominous Prediction. The village of St. Mary Mead was as quiet as a sleeping cat, tucked between rolling green hills and a lazy river that sparkled under the evening sun. Its cottages, with their tidy gardens and ivy-covered walls, looked like they belonged in a storybook. Every Tuesday night, the village hall came alive with chatter and laughter. The Tuesday Night Club, a small group of locals, met to share stories, sip tea, and trade gossip. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, or thought they did. Tonight, though, the air felt heavier, like a storm was waiting to break. Miss Jane Marple sat in her usual corner, her knitting needles clicking softly. Her white hair was neatly pinned, and her sharp blue eyes flickered over the room, taking in every detail. She wore a simple wool cardigan, but there was nothing simple about her mind. To the others, she was just a sweet old lady who loved her roses and tea, but those who knew her well, like her nephew Raymond or Inspector Craddock, knew she could spot a lie faster than a fox could sniff out a hen. The hall was cozy, with wooden beams and a crackling fire. A long table held a teapot, mismatched cups, and a plate of warm scones. The group was small but lively. Dr. Haydock, with his bushy brows and loud laugh, Mrs. Bantry, who loved a good scandal, young Lucy Islesborough, sharp and curious, and Mr. Petherick, the fussy lawyer who always carried a notebook. Tonight, though, they were joined by a newcomer, Colonel Hargrove, a tall man with a stern face and a voice like gravel. He'd moved into the big house on the hill 3 months ago, and nobody quite liked him. His sharp tongue and cold manners didn't help. The talk started lightly. Mrs. Bantry was telling a story about a missing necklace at a London party. "It was stolen right under everyone's noses," she said, her eyes wide. "The thief was the butler, of course. He had the best chance to slip it into his pocket." Dr. Haydock chuckled, stirring his tea. "Chance, you say? I think motive matters more. Nobody steals unless they want something badly. Money, revenge, or love." Lucy leaned forward, her dark curls bouncing. "But sometimes it's just luck, isn't it? Like finding a purse on the street and nobody's watching. Chance gives you the moment." Mr. Petherick shook his head, scribbling in his notebook. "Motive and chance must both be there. A thief needs a reason and a way to act. Without both, it's just a daydream." Miss Marple's needles paused. She smiled faintly, her eyes on her knitting. "Motive and chance," she said softly, almost to herself. "They're like two sides of a coin. One without the other is nothing, but together, oh, they can tell quite a story." Colonel Hargrove snorted. "Rubbish! People make too much of these things. Most crimes are simple. Someone gets angry, grabs a knife, and that's that. No need for fancy theories." His tone was sharp, cutting through the warm room like a cold wind. The others went quiet. Mrs. Bantry raised an eyebrow, but Miss Marple only smiled again, her needles clicking once more. She didn't argue, but her mind was already turning, storing away the colonel's words like a squirrel hiding nuts for winter. The talk moved on. Lucy shared a tale about a shopkeeper caught selling fake goods, and Dr. Haydock told a funny story about a patient who faked being sick to skip work. But the mood stayed tense thanks to the colonel. He didn't join in much, just sat there with his hard eyes and tight jaw. When he did speak, it was to snap at someone. "That's nonsense," he said when Lucy suggested a crime could happen by accident. "Nobody kills or steals without planning it." Miss Marple tilted her head, watching him. She noticed how his fingers gripped his teacup too tightly, how his shoulders stiffened when anyone mentioned money or secrets. To her, people were like open books, their gestures and glances telling stories they didn't know they were sharing. The Colonel, she thought, was hiding something. Maybe not a crime, but something heavy. A grudge? A fear? She tucked the thought away, like a bookmark in her mind. As the evening wore on, the group grew bolder. Mrs. Bantry, sipping her third cup of tea, leaned toward the Colonel. "You must have seen plenty of trouble in your army days, Colonel Hargrove. Any mysteries you'd care to share? We'd love a good story." The Colonel's face darkened. "Mysteries," he said. "I've seen betrayal, greed, and stupidity. That's what drives people, not your silly puzzles." He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping the floor. "I'm done here. Good night." He stormed out, leaving the room silent. Dr. Haydock cleared his throat. "Well, he's a cheerful fellow, isn't he?" Lucy giggled, but Mrs. Bantry frowned. "He's got a temper. I heard he argued with his maid last week, shouted loud enough for the neighbors to hear. Something about a broken vase." Mr. Petherick nodded, jotting it down. "And his nephew, young Tom Hargrove, was at the pub last night, muttering about the Colonel cutting him out of the will. Bad blood there, I'd say." Miss Marple said nothing, but her eyes gleamed. She'd heard the same gossip. The maid, Elsie, who'd worked for the Colonel for years but was paid poorly. Tom, the nephew, who gambled and owed money all over town. The vicar, Mr. Clement, who'd been seen whispering with the Colonel's neighbor, a pretty widow named Mrs. Leela Gray. And then there was Mrs. Gray herself, who'd visited the Colonel's house often, always leaving with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. To Miss Marple, these were threads in a tapestry waiting to be woven together. The meeting ended soon after. The group bundled up against the chilly night and stepped outside, where the stars shone like scattered diamonds. Miss Marple walked slowly, leaning on her stick, her mind busy. She was thinking about motive and chance again, how they danced together in every crime. She remembered a girl in her village years ago who'd stolen a brooch, not because she needed it, but because she could. Chance had given her the moment. Motive had pushed her to act. As she reached her cottage gate, a bicycle skidded to a stop beside her. It was Tommy, the baker's boy, his face pale under the moonlight. "Miss Marple," he gasped, "you've got to come quick. It's Colonel Hargrove. He's dead." Miss Marple's heart skipped, but her face stayed calm. "Dead?" she replied. "How, Tommy?" "Shot, they say, in his study, all alone. The door was locked from the inside. Police are there now. Oh, it's awful." She patted his arm. "Thank you, Tommy. Run along and tell Inspector Craddock I'll be there soon." As the boy pedaled off, Miss Marple stood still, her shawl tight around her shoulders. A locked room, a gunshot, a man nobody liked. Motive and chance, she thought, were already circling each other like cats in a barn. She turned back toward the big house on the hill, her steps steady but her mind racing. The Colonel's house was grand, with tall windows and a heavy oak door. By the time Miss Marple arrived, a small crowd had gathered outside, neighbors in coats, whispering and shivering. Inspector Craddock, a solid man with kind eyes, met her at the gate. "Miss Marple," he said, tipping his hat, "I shouldn't be surprised you're here. Care to take a look? It's a strange one." "Strange, you say?" she replied, her voice soft but curious. "I'll just have a peek, if you don't mind." Inside, the house felt cold, despite the fire in the hall. The study was down a long corridor, its door ajar. Colonel Hargrove lay slumped over his desk, a pistol beside his hand. Blood stained the papers beneath him, and a single bullet hole marked his temple. The room smelled faintly of gunpowder, and something else. Lavender, perhaps. Miss Marple's nose twitched, but she said nothing. Craddock pointed to the door. Locked from the inside when we got here, windows bolted too. Looks like he did it himself, but something's off. No note, for one thing. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes scanning the room. The desk was tidy, except for a teacup pushed to one side, its saucer missing. A book lay open on a chair, its pages fluttering as if someone had left in a hurry. Small things, but to Miss Marple, they were like footprints in the snow. She stepped closer, peering at the teacup. Odd place for a cup, don't you think? And that scent. Lavender, perhaps. Craddock frowned. Lavender? I don't smell anything but smoke. What are you getting at? Oh, nothing yet, she said, smiling. Just noticing. As they left the study, Miss Marple glanced at the crowd outside. Elsie, the maid, stood red-eyed, clutching a handkerchief. Tom Hargrove lingered at the back.
Chapter 2. The Scene of the Crime. The morning after Colonel Hargrove's death, St. Mary Mead buzzed like a hive of bees. The village square, usually quiet with only the baker's cart and a few chatting neighbors, was alive with whispers. People stood in knots, heads close, talking about the gunshot, the locked room, and the grim scene at the big house on the hill. Miss Jane Marple, bundled in her shawl, walked slowly through the crowd, her sharp eyes catching every glance and murmur. She didn't say much, but she listened, her mind sorting the chatter like pieces of a puzzle. At the colonel's house, Inspector Craddock was already hard at work. The big oak door stood open now, and 2 young policemen guarded it, looking nervous. Inside, the air was cold and heavy, the kind of stillness that follows a storm. Miss Marple followed Craddock to the study, her stick tapping softly on the polished floor. The room was just as she'd seen it last night. The colonel slumped over his desk, the pistol by his hand, the blood now dried on the papers. The teacup still sat oddly to one side, and that faint lavender scent lingered, though Craddock didn't seem to notice. Still no note, Craddock said, rubbing his chin. If it was suicide, you'd think he'd leave a word or two. And this locked door, bolted from the inside, windows shut tight. It's a real mystery, Miss Marple. She nodded, her eyes roaming the room. A puzzle indeed, Inspector, but puzzles have pieces, and they always fit together if you look closely. Craddock raised an eyebrow, but didn't argue. He trusted her, even if he didn't always understand her. Well, let's see what we've got. The colonel was shot around 7:15 last night, going by the stopped clock. Nobody heard the shot. There was a storm, thunder loud enough to drown it out. We've got suspects, though, and plenty of them. He led her to the drawing room, where 4 people waited, each looking uneasy in their own way. There was Elsie, the maid, her eyes red from crying, twisting her apron in her hands. Tom Hargrove, the colonel's nephew, slouched in a chair, his face pale and his fingers tapping nervously. Mrs. Lila Gray, the pretty widow from next door, sat straight-backed, her hands folded, but her eyes darting. And Mr. Clement, the vicar, stood by the window, his face calm, but his fingers clutching a prayer book too tightly. Miss Marple settled into a chair, her knitting bag on her lap. She didn't pull out her needles. She didn't need to. Her hands were still, but her mind was busy, watching the 4 like a cat watches mice. Craddock began his questions, his notebook open. "Elsie," he started, "you worked for the colonel for years. Tell me about last night." Elsie sniffed, her voice shaky.
I was in the kitchen, sir, cleaning up after supper. The colonel was in his study as usual. He liked to be alone after 6. I heard him lock the door, always did that. I left at 7, like always, before the storm hit. I swear I didn't hear a thing." Craddock nodded. "And you, Tom, where were you?" Tom shifted, his eyes flicking to the floor. "I was at the Red Lion, the pub in Lower Mead. Left around 6, got there by 1:30. Plenty of folks saw me. I wasn't here when it happened." Miss Marple tilted her head. The Red Lion was a good 5 miles away, a long walk in the rain. She made a mental note, her eyes soft but sharp. Craddock turned to Mrs. Gray. "And you, ma'am, I hear you visited the colonel last night." Mrs. Gray's smile was tight, like a mask. "Yes, Inspector. I stopped by around 6 to return a book he'd lent me. We chatted for a few minutes, about gardening, nothing more. I left before 7, well before the storm. He was alive and well when I said goodbye." Miss Marple noticed how her fingers smoothed her skirt, a nervous habit. And that scent again, lavender, faint but clear, clung to the air near her. Curious, she thought. Finally, Craddock faced the vicar. "Mr. Clement, you were seen near the house around 7. Care to explain?" The vicar's face flushed, but his voice was steady. "I was on my evening walk, Inspector. The colonel's house is on my usual path. I saw the lights on, but I didn't stop. I was home by 7:30, as my housekeeper can confirm." Craddock scribbled in his notebook, then looked at Miss Marple. "Any thoughts, Miss Marple? You've got a knack for this sort of thing." She smiled, her voice gentle. "Oh, I'm just an old lady, Inspector, but I do wonder about that teacup on the desk. It's not in its place, is it? And the clock stopped at 7:15. Clocks don't stop unless someone stops them, do they?" Craddock frowned, glancing at the study door. "You think someone tampered with it?" "I think," she said, "that things are not always what they seem. A locked door can hide many secrets, and a stopped clock can tell more than the time." The inspector sighed, used to her cryptic ways. He turned back to the suspects. "All right, you're free to go for now, but don't leave the village. We'll talk again." As the 4 filed out, Miss Marple watched them go. Elsie's shoulders were slumped like she carried a heavy load. Tom's steps were quick, almost guilty. Mrs. Gray moved gracefully, but her eyes flickered to the study door. And Mr. Clement clutched his prayer book like a shield. Each had a story, Miss Marple thought, and one of them wasn't telling the truth. Outside, the village was still buzzing. Miss Marple lingered by the gate where a small crowd had gathered. Mrs. Bantry was there, her eyes bright with excitement. "Oh, Miss Marple, isn't it dreadful? A locked room, a gunshot? Why, it's like one of those novels." "Quite," Miss Marple said, her smile faint. "But life, Mrs. Bantry, is often stranger than novels, and people, well, people are never quite what they seem." Mrs. Bantry chattered on, but Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere. She was thinking about the teacup, out of place on a tidy man's desk, the lavender scent, so faint but so specific, the clock stopped at 7:15 when the storm was at its worst, and the suspects, Elsie, with her loyalty but her grudges, Tom, with his debts and his shaky alibi, Mrs. Gray, with her charm and her secrets, and Mr. Clement, with his calm face but nervous hands. She remembered a story from years ago about a girl in her village who'd broken a window and blamed it on a stray ball. The girl had a reason, anger at her strict father, and a chance when nobody was looking. Motive and chance, Miss Marple thought, always dancing together. In this case, someone had a reason to want the colonel dead. Money, revenge, or something else. And someone had a moment, a fleeting chance in that locked room to make it happen. As she walked home, the wind carried the scent of rain and roses. She passed the church, where Mr. Clement was hurrying inside, his head down. She saw Tom at the pub's edge, talking to a man in a low voice, and Mrs. Gray, standing at her gate, watched her pass with eyes that didn't blink. Miss Marple's stick tapped the path, steady as her thoughts. The puzzle was taking shape, piece by piece. The locked room wasn't locked, really, not to someone who knew how to open it. And the truth, she knew, was waiting to be found, hidden in the small things nobody else saw. Back at her cottage, she lit the fire and sat in her armchair, her knitting untouched. The lavender scent stayed in her mind, like a clue that wouldn't let go. She closed her eyes, picturing the study, the teacup, the clock. "Motive and chance," she whispered. "One of you is lying, and I'll find out who."
Chapter 3. Motives in the Shadows. The sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, painting the village in gold and long shadows. By midday, the news of Colonel Hargrove's death had spread like wildfire, and the village was alive with whispers. At the post office, Mrs. Price, the postmistress, leaned over the counter, telling anyone who'd listen about the Colonel's temper. At the bakery, Tommy's mother muttered about Tom Hargrove's gambling debts. And in the churchyard, old Mr. Wicks swore he'd seen Mrs. Leela Gray near the Colonel's house just before the storm. Miss Jane Marple heard it all as she walked her usual path, her stick tapping the cobblestones, her ears open like a fox's. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by her window, a cup of tea cooling beside her. Her knitting lay untouched. Her mind was too busy. The Colonel's death was no simple matter. A locked room, a stopped clock, a misplaced teacup, and that faint lavender scent. Small things, but they told a story. She thought of her suspects: Elsie, the maid; Tom, the nephew; Mrs. Gray, the widow; and Mr. Clement, the vicar. Each had secrets, and secrets, she knew, were the roots of motive. Inspector Craddock had sent word that he'd be at the Colonel's house again, digging deeper into the suspects' lives. Miss Marple decided to join him, not because she was nosy, though some in the village called her that, but because she couldn't help seeing patterns, like threads in her knitting. She wrapped her shawl and headed out, the autumn air crisp against her cheeks. At the big house, Craddock was in the drawing room, his notebook full of scribbles. The four suspects were there again, looking more uneasy than the day before. Elsie's eyes were puffy, her hands twisting a damp handkerchief. Tom slouched, his jaw tight, avoiding everyone's gaze. Mrs. Gray sat with her usual grace, but her fingers tapped a quiet rhythm on her knee. Mr. Clement stood by a bookshelf, his face calm, but his eyes flickering like a candle in a draught. Craddock cleared his throat. He said, "We've got more questions. The Colonel's death wasn't suicide. The angle of the shot, the lack of a note, it points to murder. Someone in this village had a reason and a way to do it. Let's start with you, Elsie." Elsie's head snapped up. "Me, sir? I'd never. I worked for the Colonel 10 years, even when he was cruel. He paid me poorly, shouted over nothing, a broken plate, a late tea, but I needed the job. I was in the kitchen all evening, then went home before 7. Ask Mrs. Price. She saw me pass the post office." Craddock nodded, writing it down. "Motives clear enough. Bad treatment, low wages, but your alibi holds for now. Tom, your turn. You said you're at the Red Lion, but we're checking that. The Colonel was changing his will, wasn't he? Cutting you out?" Tom's face reddened. "That's no secret. He thought I was a fool, always gambling. I owed money, still do, but I was at the pub miles away. Ask the barman, Joe. I didn't even know about the will till after he died." Miss Marple watched Tom's hands, how they clenched when he spoke. Fear, she thought, or guilt. She remembered a boy in her village years ago caught stealing apples because he owed a debt. He'd lied with the same nervous energy. Craddock turned to Mrs. Gray. "You said you visited to return a book. Just a friendly chat, was it? We heard the Colonel argued with you last week.
Something about land he owned, land you wanted. Mrs. Gray's smile didn't waver, but her eyes grew sharp. A misunderstanding, Inspector. He owned a field I thought might suit a garden project. We talked it over, settled it. Last night, I was there 10 minutes, no more. I left him alive, reading in his study. Miss Marple's nose twitched. That lavender scent again, stronger near Mrs. Gray. She made a mental note, her face as soft as ever. Finally, Craddock faced Mr. Clement. Vicar, you were near the house at 7, and there's talk you and the Colonel didn't get on. Something about a church fund he refused to support? Mr. Clement's fingers tightened on his prayer book. We had differences, yes. He thought the church spent too much on repairs, but I'd never harm him. I was walking, as I said. My housekeeper, Mrs. Norris, can confirm I was home by 7:30. Miss Marple tilted her head. The vicar's voice was steady, but his hands betrayed him. She thought of a curate she knew in youth, caught in a lie because he couldn't stop fidgeting. Craddock closed his notebook. We're digging deeper. Nobody leaves the village till we're done. As the suspects left, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes on the study door. She stepped inside, Craddock following. The room was unchanged. The desk, the pistol, the teacup, the stopped clock. She knelt by the desk, peering at the teacup. She said, still out of place. And that scent, lavender, I'm sure of it. Craddock sniffed the air. He said, I don't smell anything. You think it's important? She said, everything's important, Inspector, until it isn't, she smiled. She pointed to the clock. She said, stopped at 7:15. A storm was raging then, wasn't it? Thunder, rain? Nobody would hear a shot. Quite a convenient time. Craddock's eyes narrowed. He said, you think someone set the clock back to confuse us? She said, I think that chance is rarely just chance. Someone made sure this room looked locked, this clock stopped, this death a mystery. Motive hides in the shadows, but we'll find it. Back in the village, Miss Marple stopped at the post office. Mrs. Price was eager to talk. She said, Elsie passed by at 7, just like she said, but I saw Tom too earlier than he claims, near the Colonel's gate at 6, not at the pub. And Mrs. Gray? She's been cozy with the Colonel for weeks, always visiting. As for the vicar, he's been odd lately, whispering with folks he shouldn't. Miss Marple nodded, storing each word. She walked on, passing the church. Inside, Mr. Clement was polishing a candlestick, his movements quick, nervous. She saw Tom at the pub, arguing with a man in a low voice, and Mrs. Gray, watering her roses, watched her pass with a cool stare. At home, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her tea untouched. She thought of Elsie, angry but loyal, with a motive but a solid alibi. Tom, desperate for money, his alibi shaky. Mrs. Gray, charming but secretive, her visits too frequent. And Mr. Clement, calm but hiding something. Motive and chance, she thought, were tangled like wool. She remembered a woman in her youth who'd poisoned a rival, not for love, but for pride. The chance came by accident, a dropped bottle, but the motive was planned. The lavender scent nagged at her. She'd smelled it near Mrs. Gray, but also in the study. A perfume? A flower? She closed her eyes, picturing the room, the teacup, out of place, the clock, stopped, the pistol too clean for a struggle. Someone had a reason to kill the Colonel. Money, land, pride. And someone had a moment, a storm's cover, a locked room that wasn't truly locked. She opened her eyes, her face calm, but her mind sharp. She whispered, motive in the shadows, but light always finds it.
Chapter 4. Threads of Opportunity. The fog rolled into St. Mary Mead like a soft blanket, muffling the village's usual hum. By Wednesday morning, the air was thick, and the cobblestone streets glistened with damp. Miss Jane Marple stood at her garden gate, her shawl tight against the chill. She watched the milkman clatter by, his bottles jingling, and listened to the whispers of passerby. Colonel Hargrove's murder was all anyone could talk about. The locked room, the gunshot, the stopped clock, each detail twisted into wild stories. But Miss Marple didn't care for rumors. She cared for facts, and facts, she knew, hid in plain sight, like weeds in a rosebed. She made her way to the Colonel's house, where Inspector Craddock was sifting through new clues. The big house loomed through the fog, its windows dark. Inside, the study was untouched, still holding its secrets. The teacup out of place, the clock frozen at 7:15, the faint lavender scent that only Miss Marple seemed to notice. Craddock met her in the hall, his face tired but determined. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, flipping open his notebook. "We've got a few things. A letter found in the Colonel's desk, looks forged, and the clock. The mechanism was jammed, not broken. Someone stopped it on purpose." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "On purpose, you say? That's interesting. A clock doesn't lie unless someone makes it." Craddock nodded. "And the letter? It's to Tom, the nephew, saying the Colonel was cutting him out of the will for good. But the handwriting's off, like someone faked it. We're checking it now." She followed him to the drawing room, where the suspects were gathered again. Elsie, the maid, sat with her head down, her hands still. Tom Hargrove paced, his boots scuffing the rug. Mrs. Lila Gray leaned against a chair, her smile tight. Mr. Clement, the vicar, stood by the fire, his fingers tracing the edge of his prayer book. The air was heavy, like the fog outside.
Chapter 5. The Web of Deception. The fog had lifted from St. Mary Mead by Thursday morning, leaving the village bright under a crisp autumn sun. The air carried the scent of damp leaves and chimney smoke, but the buzz of Colonel Hargrove's murder still hung heavier than the mist. Miss Jane Marple sat in her garden, pruning her roses, her sharp eyes catching every detail around her: the postman's hurried steps, the baker's boy whispering to a friend, the way Mrs. Gray's curtains twitched across the lane. Her hands worked the shears, but her mind wove through the clues: the stopped clock, the misplaced teacup, the forged letter, and that stubborn lavender scent. Inspector Craddock had called her to the colonel's house again. New evidence had turned up, and he wanted her keen eye. As she walked up the hill, her stick tapping steadily, she thought about the suspects. Elsie, the maid, had a grudge but a solid alibi. Tom Hargrove, the nephew, had debts and a shaky story. Mrs. Leela Gray, the widow, had charm and secrets tied to the lavender. Mr. Clement, the vicar, seemed honest but nervous, his hands always betraying him. Motive and chance, Miss Marple thought, were tangled like ivy, but the truth was close. At the big house, Craddock met her in the hall, his face grim. "We've got trouble, Miss Marple. Found a handkerchief in the study. Initials E.M. It's Elsie's. And the fingerprint on the teacup matches hers. Looks bad for her." Miss Jane Marple tilted her head. "Elsie's, you say? But she's the maid. Her prints would be everywhere. And a handkerchief? Easy to drop, easier to plant." Craddock frowned. "You think someone's setting her up?" "I think," she said softly, "that a web of deception is spun with care. Let's see what our friends have to say." In the drawing room, the suspects were gathered, more tense than ever. Elsie sat hunched, her face pale, clutching a fresh handkerchief. Tom leaned against the wall, his eyes darting. Mrs. Gray sat with her usual grace, but her fingers twisted a ring on her hand. Mr. Clement stood by a window, his prayer book shut tight. Craddock held up the handkerchief, its embroidered E.M. clear in the light. "Elsie," he said, "this was found near the desk, and your fingerprints on the teacup. Care to explain?" Elsie gasped, her eyes wide. I clean the study every day. My prints are on everything. And that handkerchief, I lost it weeks ago. I swear I didn't do it." Craddock turned to the others. "Anyone know how this got there?" Tom shrugged, his voice sharp. "Sounds like she's guilty. She hated him, always muttering about his temper." Elsie's head snapped up. "That's not fair. You were the one sneaking around, Tom. I saw you near the house that evening, before the storm." Tom's face reddened. "Lies. I was at the Red Lion. Joe will tell you." Craddock raised a hand. "We checked with Joe. He says you left the pub by 6:30, Tom. Plenty of time to get here before 7:15. Miss Marple watched Tom's hands clench. She thought of a boy in her village caught lying about a stolen pie. Same guilty flush. Mrs. Gray spoke, her voice smooth. "Inspector, Elsie is a dear, but she was always cross with the colonel. And Tom, well, he's young, reckless, but surely neither could plan such a thing." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Mrs. Gray's words were kind, but they pointed fingers, deflecting attention. And that lavender scent, stronger today, clinging to her shawl. Craddock turned to Mr. Clement. "Vicar, you've been quiet. That pamphlet we found, it had a note in the margin, 'In your writing. Talk to H about funds.' Care to explain?" Mr. Clement's face flushed. I wrote it weeks ago. The colonel promised a donation, then backed out. I was frustrated, yes, but I didn't harm him. I was home by 7:30, as I said." Miss Marple noted his trembling hands. She remembered a gardener once who'd lied about cutting a tree to hide a theft. Same nervous twitch. Craddock sighed. "Elsie, I'm sorry, but the evidence points to you. You're under arrest until we sort this out." Elsie sobbed, shaking her head. "I didn't do it, I swear." As a policeman led her away, Miss Marple spoke softly. "Inspector, might I see the study again? Just a quick look." Craddock nodded, used to her ways. In the study, the air was still heavy with gunpowder and lavender. The teacups sat on the desk, the clock frozen at 7:15, the forged letter now in a police bag. Miss Marple knelt by the desk, peering at the handkerchief spot. Dropped near the desk, you say, but not under it. Odd place to lose something. She stood, her eyes on the clock. And this, jammed, not broken. Someone wanted us to think the time was exact. Craddock rubbed his chin. You think it's a setup? But Elsie's fingerprints, her handkerchief. Motive without chance is just anger. Chance without motive is an accident. Elsie had motive, but her alibi's strong. Someone else had both, and a plan. Back in the village, the news of Elsie's arrest spread fast. Mrs. Bantry caught Miss Marple at the post office. Elsie? Oh, it can't be. She's a mouse, not a murderer. But that Tom, he's trouble. And Mrs. Gray? So sweet. But I saw her arguing with the colonel last month over that field. Miss Marple nodded, her face calm. People see what they want, Mrs. Bantry, but the truth hides in what they miss. She walked on, passing the pub. Tom was inside, his voice loud, insisting he was innocent. At the church, Mr. Clement was praying, his head bowed. Mrs. Gray was in her garden, clipping lavender bushes, her eyes meeting Miss Marple's for a moment before looking away. At home, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting untouched. The web was tightening. Elsie's arrest felt wrong, too neat, like a bow on a trap. The handkerchief, the fingerprint, easy to plant, hard to disprove. Tom's alibi was cracking. He'd left the pub early, giving him time. Mrs. Gray's lavender tied her to the scene, and her calm was too perfect. Mr. Clement's note and nerves hinted at secrets. The forged letter pointed to Tom, but who wrote it? The clock, stopped at 7:15, screamed of a plan, and the storm had hidden the shot. She recalled a story from her youth about a woman who'd framed her rival with a stolen ring. The woman had motive, jealousy, and chance, a moment when nobody watched. Here, someone had motive, money, land, or revenge. And someone had chance, a storm's cover, a forged letter, a planted clue. Motive and chance, she whispered, but the web is starting to fray.
Chapter 6. Miss Marple's Quiet Revelations. The sun dipped low over St. Mary Mead, casting a warm glow on the village's thatched roofs and tidy gardens. By Friday afternoon, the air was thick with tension, not breeze. Elsie, the maid, sat in a cell, accused of Colonel Hargrove's murder, but the village buzzed with doubt. Miss Jane Marple sipped tea at her cottage, her knitting idle on the table. Her sharp eyes, hidden behind a gentle smile, pieced together the clues. The stopped clock, the misplaced teacup, the forged letter, the lavender scent, and Elsie's handkerchief too conveniently placed. The web of deception was unraveling, and Miss Marple knew the truth was close, like a shadow stepping into light. She'd asked Inspector Craddock to gather the suspects at the colonel's house one last time. The big house felt colder now, its grandeur dimmed by death. In the drawing room, Craddock stood by the fire, his notebook shut. Tom Hargrove slouched in a chair, his face pale, fingers drumming. Mrs. Leela Gray sat with her usual poise, but her eyes flicked nervously. Mr. Clement, the vicar, clutched his prayer book, his knuckles white. Elsie was there too, released on bail, but trembling, her eyes red. Miss Marple settled in a corner, her shawl neat, her face calm, but her mind sharp as a needle. Craddock cleared his throat. We've gone round and round. A locked room, a gunshot, a stopped clock.
Elsie's handkerchief and fingerprint pointed to her, but Miss Marple here has another idea. Care to share, ma'am?" Miss Marple smiled softly. "Oh, I'm just an old lady who notices things, like how people are never quite what they seem. In my village, years ago, a girl stole a locket and blamed another. She used a storm to hide her steps, much like the storm that hid the colonel's shot. Motive and chance, you see, always dance together." She turned to Elsie. "You, dear, had reason to dislike the colonel. His harsh words, his stingy pay. But you were home by 7, seen by Mrs. Price. Your handkerchief and fingerprint? Too easy to plant. Someone wanted you to take the blame." Elsie's eyes widened, her hands still. Tom shifted, his jaw tight. Mrs. Leela Gray smile froze, and Mr. Clemens' fingers twitched. Miss Marple looked at Tom. "You, Tom, had debts and no inheritance. Your alibi at the Red Lion fell apart. Joe saw you leave by 6:30. You were near the house, weren't you? But a forged letter pointing to you feels too neat, like someone wanted you to look guilty." Tom's face reddened. "I didn't do it. I was angry, sure, but I didn't kill him." She nodded, her eyes moving to Mr. Clement. "And you, Vicar? Had a falling out over church funds? Your pamphlet, your note? Small secrets, but secrets all the same. Your hands shake when you speak of that night. Yet your housekeeper swears you were home by 7:30. A thin alibi, but it holds." Mr. Clement swallowed, his voice low. I argued with him, yes, but I'd never harm anyone." Miss Marple's gaze settled on Mrs. Gray. "And you, Mrs. Gray, so charming, so kind. You visited often, borrowed books, talked of gardens, but you wanted the colonel's field, didn't you? And that lavender scent, it's in your garden, on your shawl, and in the study. Curious, isn't it?" Mrs. Gray's smile wavered. "Lavender? Many people wear it. I was only a neighbor, nothing more." Miss Marple's voice stayed gentle, but her words cut like a blade. "I've seen many neighbors, Mrs. Gray. Years ago, a woman in my village poisoned her rival, using a storm to hide her steps. She wore a scent to seem innocent. But scents linger, like truth. The colonel's death wasn't chance, it was planned. The clock was stopped to fix the time. The letter was forged to point to Tom. The handkerchief was planted to trap Elsie. And the locked room? Not locked at all. A window bolt was loose, just enough for someone to slip in, shoot, and slip out, locking it behind them." Craddock's eyes widened. "The window? But it was bolted tight." "Check it again, Inspector," Miss Marple said. "A clever hand can make a bolt look secure. And the storm, oh, it hid the shot perfectly, didn't it?" She turned to Mrs. Gray, her voice soft but firm. "You visited at 6, you said, but you stayed longer. The colonel didn't just argue about land, he humiliated you, didn't he? Years ago, he ruined your family, took everything. You waited years, planned it perfectly. The storm was your chance, used your charm to get close, and planned it all. The clock, the letter, the handkerchief. Lavender gave you away." Mrs. Gray's face paled, her hands trembling. "That's absurd! You've no proof!" Miss Marple smiled. "The teacup, Mrs. Gray. It had a smudge, not Elsie's, but yours. The police will check it. And the lavender in your garden matches the scent in the study. You slipped in through the window, shot him, and made it look like suicide. Motive? Revenge. Chance? The storm you use so well." Craddock stepped forward, his face grim. We'll check the window and the smudge. If they match, you're coming with us." Mrs. Gray's mask cracked. Her shoulders slumped, and her voice broke. "He ruined my family, took everything. I waited years, planned it perfectly. The storm was my chance. I thought I'd get away." Craddock nodded to a policeman who led her out. The room was silent, save for Elsie's soft sob of relief. Tom stared at the floor, his face pale. Mr. Clement bowed his head, muttering a prayer. Miss Marple stood, her stick tapping. Motive and chance, they always tell the story if you listen. Outside, the village was calm again, the sun setting over the hills. Miss Marple walked home, her mind at ease. The truth had come to light, as it always did, like a rose blooming through thorns.
Chapter 7. Justice and Reflection. The sun rose gently over St. Mary Mead on Saturday morning, bathing the village in a soft, golden light. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of fresh grass and baking bread from the village shop. The buzz of Colonel Hargrove's murder had quieted, replaced by a sense of calm, like the stillness after a storm. Miss Jane Marple sat in her parlor, her knitting needles clicking softly, a cup of tea steaming beside her. Her sharp eyes, softened by a smile, gazed out the window at the familiar cottages. The truth had come to light, and the village could breathe again. Mrs. Leela Gray's confession had spread through St. Mary Mead like ripples on a pond. She'd admitted to the murder, driven by a deep grudge. Years ago, the colonel had swindled her family out of their land, leaving them penniless. She'd waited, planned, and used the storm's cover to stage the perfect crime, manipulating the clock, forging a letter, and planting Elsie's handkerchief. But Miss Marple's quiet observations, the lavender scent, the smudged teacup, the loose window bolt, had unraveled her web. Mrs. Gray was now in custody, awaiting trial, her charm no match for truth. Inspector Craddock stopped by Miss Marple's cottage that morning, his hat in hand. "You did it again, Miss Marple," he said, shaking his head. "That window bolt, loose, just as you said, and the teacup smudge matched her prints, not Elsie's. How do you spot these things?" Miss Marple smiled, her needles pausing. "Oh, Inspector, I just watch people. They're like my roses, beautiful, but their thorns tell the real story. Motive and chance, you see, always leave a trail." He chuckled, tipping his hat. "Well, the village owes you. Elsie's free, Tom's cleared, and the vicar's back to his sermons. You've got a gift." As he left, Miss Marple thought of the suspects, now free of suspicion. Elsie, the maid, had returned to her duties, her head high, her loyalty proven. Tom Hargrove, the nephew, was shaken but relieved, vowing to curb his gambling. Mr. Clement, the vicar, had confessed to a small lie. He'd argued with the colonel over funds, but feared it would look bad. His honesty had cleared his name. That afternoon, the Tuesday night club gathered at the village hall, their first meeting since the murder. The fire crackled, the teapot steamed, and the air was warm with chatter. Mrs. Bantry, her eyes bright, poured tea for all. Dr. Haydock, Lucy Islesborough, and Mr. Petherick sat around the table, their faces lighter than they had been in days. Miss Marple took her usual corner, knitting quietly, her eyes on the group. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward. "Miss Marple, you must tell us how you knew. Mrs. Gray, so charming, so clever, I'd never have guessed." Miss Marple's needles clicked. People are never what they seem, Mrs. Bantry. I once knew a woman in my village, years ago, who smiled like an angel but stole from her own sister. It was the little things, her too perfect story, the way she fidgeted. Mrs. Gray was the same. Her lavender gave her away, and her plan was too neat. Real life, you see, is messier than a perfect crime. Dr. Haydock laughed. You're a marvel, Miss Marple. That lavender, I'd never have noticed. And the window bolt, pure genius. Lucy grinned. You said motive and chance danced together. You saw their steps before anyone else. Mr. Petherick nodded, his notebook open but unused. I thought it was Elsie or Tom. But you saw the truth. Mrs. Gray's motive was revenge, and the storm was her chance. Miss Marple smiled. Motive without chance is just a wish. Chance without motive is an accident. Mrs. Gray had both, and she wove them into a trap. But truth, like a good stitch, always holds. The group raised their teacups, toasting her quietly. Later, news came that the Colonel's will had been read. Against all odds, he'd left his estate to Tom, with a condition to pay off his debts and reform. Elsie received a small sum, enough to ease her burdens. The village, Miss Marple thought, would heal, like a garden after pruning. As the meeting ended, the group stepped into the evening. The stars twinkled above St. Mary Mead, and the river murmured softly. Miss Marple walked home, her stick tapping, her heart light. She thought of her roses, how they bloomed despite thorns. People were the same, flawed, complex, but capable of truth. At her cottage, she sat by the fire, her knitting in her lap, the lavender scent, the stopped clock, the forged letter, all pieces of a puzzle now solved. In the end, she whispered, motive triumphs over chance when wisdom sees through the veil. The village was at peace, justice served, and Miss Marple's quiet wisdom had lit the way, as it always did.
Chapter 8. A Village Restored. The autumn leaves fell softly in St. Mary Mead, painting the village paths in shades of red and gold. By Sunday morning, a week after Colonel Hargrove's murder, the village had settled into a quiet rhythm, like a river finding its course again. The church bells rang, calling folks to service, and the air smelled of fresh bread and damp earth. Miss Jane Marple sat in her garden, her shawl snug against the morning chill, pruning shears in hand. Her roses were thriving, despite the season's turn, and she smiled at their stubborn beauty. Her mind, though, was still on the case, picking at its edges like a loose stitch. The village had moved on, or so it seemed. Mrs. Lila Gray was gone, taken to face trial in the county court. Her confession had shocked St. Mary Mead. Her charm had hidden the heart full of revenge, rooted in the Colonel's old betrayal of her family. The forged letter, the planted handkerchief, the stopped clock, and the lavender scent had all been part of her careful plan, undone by Miss Marple's sharp eyes. Elsie, the maid, was back at work, her name cleared. Tom Hargrove, the nephew, had sworn to change his ways, touched by the Colonel's will. Mr. Clement, the vicar, led his flock with renewed calm, his small lie forgiven. Justice had been served, and the village felt whole again. Miss Marple clipped a faded rose, her thoughts drifting. She'd been invited to the vicarage that afternoon for tea, a small gathering to put the Tuesday night club back on track. As she walked through the village, her stick tapping the cobblestones,
She noticed the little signs of life returning. Mrs. Price at the post office, laughing with a customer. Tommy, the baker's boy, whistling as he delivered loaves. Children playing by the river, their shouts bright in the air. But Miss Marple knew villages like hers held memories, and memories, like seeds, could sprout again. At the vicarage, the fire crackled, and the table was set with scones, jam, and a steaming teapot. Mrs. Bantry was there, her eyes sparkling with gossip. Dr. Haydock poured tea, his laugh loud as ever. Lucy Islesborough sat close, her curls bouncing as she spoke. Mr. Petherick, the lawyer, scribbled in his notebook, though his pen paused more often now. Mr. Clement, the host, smiled warmly, his hands steady for the first time in days. Miss Marple took her usual chair, her knitting bag at her side, her eyes soft but watchful. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her voice low. "Miss Marple, it's a miracle you saw through Mrs. Gray. That lavender, how did you know it wasn't just a coincidence?" Miss Marple's needles clicked, though she barely looked at her knitting. "Coincidences, Mrs. Bantry, are like weeds. They seem harmless, but they're often planted. I once knew a girl in my village, years ago, who left a hairpin at a theft to blame another. The lavender was Mrs. Gray's hairpin, too strong, too specific to be chance." Dr. Haydock chuckled. "You make it sound simple, but you saw what we missed. The window bolt, the teacup smudge. Genius!" Lucy grinned. "And the clock, stopped at 7:15 just to trick us. You said motive and chance danced together, and you followed their steps." Mr. Petherick nodded. "I was sure it was Elsie or Tom, but you saw Mrs. Gray's revenge hidden behind her smile." Mr. Clement cleared his throat, his voice gentle. "I owe you thanks, Miss Marple. I was foolish, hiding my argument with the Colonel. I thought it made me look guilty. Your wisdom saved us all." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling. "People are like gardens, Mr. Clement. They grow secrets, but they also grow truth, if you tend them right. Mrs. Gray's motive was old pain. Her chance was the storm. But truth always blooms, given time." The group sipped their tea, the room warm with relief. Mrs. Bantry changed the subject, talking of the church fair, but Miss Marple's mind lingered. She thought of the Colonel's will, read days ago. Tom had inherited the estate with a clause to pay his debts and reform. Elsie had received enough to live comfortably, a small justice for her years of toil. The village was healing, but Miss Marple's sharp mind caught a final thread, something nobody else had seen. As the tea ended, she walked to the churchyard, where the roses bloomed despite the autumn chill. Mr. Clement was there, tending a flower bed. She paused, her voice soft. "Mr. Clement, you've been kinder to your flock lately. I noticed you gave Elsie extra work, and Tom advice on his debts. A good heart, but a heavy one, isn't it?" The vicar froze, his hands dirty from the soil. "What do you mean, Miss Marple?" She smiled, her eyes gentle but piercing. "I saw you that night near the Colonel's house, not at 7:15, but earlier, before the storm. You dropped that pamphlet, didn't you? And you knew about the loose window bolt? You didn't kill him, but you saw something, didn't you? Something you've kept quiet." His face paled, his voice a whisper. I saw Mrs. Gray leave the study just before 7. She looked calm, too calm. I suspected, but I was afraid to speak. I thought nobody would believe me." Miss Marple nodded. "Fear makes us silent, but truth finds a way. You've done right since, helping Elsie and Tom. Let that be enough." He bowed his head, relief in his eyes. "Thank you. I'll carry it, but I'll do better." As she walked home, the village glowed in the twilight. The church bells rang, softer now, and the river sparkled under the stars. Miss Marple's stick tapped steadily, her heart light. The case was closed, the village was restored. Elsie was free, Tom was mending, and Mr. Clement had faced his truth. Mrs. Gray's motive, revenge, had met its chance in the storm, but Miss Marple's wisdom had cut through the veil. At her cottage she sat by the fire, her knitting in her lap. The lavender scent, the stopped clock, the forged letter, all were memories now, like petals pressed in a book. She thought of her roses, how they bloomed through thorns. "In the end," she whispered, "wisdom sees what motive and chance try to hide." The fire crackled, the village slept, and St. Mary Mead was at peace. Its harmony woven tight by an old lady's quiet gaze.
Chapter 9. The Last Thread. The late September sun cast a gentle glow over St. Mary Mead, warming the cobblestone paths and the tidy gardens. It was Monday, just over a week since Mrs. Leela Gray's confession had closed the case of Colonel Hargrove's murder. The village had settled back into its quiet ways, with children laughing by the river and smoke curling from chimneys. Miss Jane Marple sat in her parlour, her knitting needles clicking softly, a pot of tea steaming on the table. Her roses outside bloomed bravely against the autumn chill, and her sharp eyes, hidden behind a kind smile, were still busy, catching the smallest details like dew on a web. Though the murder was solved, Mrs. Gray's revenge unmasked by the lavender scent, the stopped clock and the loose window bolt, Miss Marple felt a final thread dangling. It was a small thing, barely noticed by others, but to her it was like a stitch left undone. The Colonel's study had held one more clue, a tiny scrap of paper tucked under the desk, missed by the police. It bore a single word, debt, in a shady hand, not the Colonel's. She'd kept it to herself, waiting for the right moment to tug the thread. That morning she'd heard whispers at the post office. Mrs. Price mentioned a stranger in the village, seen near the Colonel's house days before the murder, asking about Tom Hargrove's debts. The man had left quickly, but his questions lingered. Miss Marple's mind turned. Tom, now inheriting the Colonel's estate, had promised to reform, but debts, she knew, could pull like chains. Had someone else known about the Colonel's will? Was the scrap of paper a clue to a deeper motive? She decided to visit the village hall, where the Tuesday night club was meeting early to plan the church fair. The hall was warm, filled with the scent of fresh scones and brewing tea. Mrs. Bantry was there, arranging flowers, her chatter bright. Dr. Haydock sipped tea, his laugh booming. Lucy Islesborough sorted ribbons, her eyes sharp. Mr. Petherick scribbled notes for the fair's budget. Mr. Clement, the vicar, smiled as he handed out cups, his hands steady now. Tom Hargrove was there too, helping carry chairs, his face less troubled than before. Miss Marple took her corner, her knitting bag at her side, her gaze soft but piercing. Mrs. Bantry spotted her. "Miss Marple, the village is itself again, thanks to you. Mrs. Gray's trial is set, and Tom's turning over a new leaf. You're a wonder." Miss Marple's needles clicked. "Kind of you, Mrs. Bantry, but villages, like gardens, always have a weed or two to pull." Dr. Haydock raised an eyebrow. "Weeds? You've solved the murder. What's left to find?" She smiled. "Small things, Doctor, like a scrap of paper with a single word, or a stranger asking questions." Tom froze, a chair halfway to the table. "What paper?" he asked, his voice tight. Miss Marple's eyes met his, gentle but firm. "A note, Tom, found under the Colonel's desk. Just one word, debt. Not his writing. and I hear a stranger was asking about you days before the murder. Care to tell us anything?" The room went quiet. Tom's face paled, his hands gripping the chair. "I don't know about any paper. My debts were no secret. The colonel knew, threatened to cut me out. But I didn't kill him." Lucy frowned. A stranger? Could they be tied to Mrs. Gray? Mr. Clement shook his head. "I saw no stranger. But, Tom, you were at the pub often. Did you owe someone dangerous?" Tom swallowed, his eyes darting. "There was a man, yes, a lender from Lower Mead. He came looking for me, said he owed big. I told him the colonel wouldn't pay. He left, angry, but that was days before." Miss Marple nodded, her voice soft. "Debt can pull strings, Tom. I once knew a boy in my village, chased by a lender who left threatening notes. The boy was innocent, but the lender stirred trouble. This stranger, did he know the colonel was changing his will?" Tom's shoulders slumped. He might have. I told him the colonel was cutting me off. He laughed, said he'd get his money somehow. But I swear I didn't see him that night." Mrs. Bantry gasped. "You think this man worked with Mrs. Gray?" Miss Marple's needles paused. "No, I think he was a shadow, not the hand. Mrs. Gray acted alone, her motive clear, but the note, the stranger, they were sparks that lit her plan. She heard the gossip, knew Tom's debts, and used them to point blame his way." Mr. Petherick scribbled. "So the note was hers, to make Tom look guilty." "Exactly," Miss Marple said, "a last thread to tie her trap. But truth, like a good stitch, holds fast. The stranger was a coincidence, but Mrs. Gray made it her chance." Craddock, who had joined the meeting late, nodded. "We'll look into this lender, Tom. But Miss Marple's right. Mrs. Gray's confession covers it all. The note was just another trick." Tom exhaled, his face easing. "I'll pay my debts, I swear. The colonel's will gives me a chance. I won't waste it." Miss Marple smiled. "Good, Tom. A garden grows best when you pull the weeds." The group laughed, the tension breaking. They turned to fair plans, talking of stalls and music. Miss Marple knitted quietly, her mind at rest. The scrap of paper, the stranger, there were small echoes of a bigger truth now laid bare. Elsie was free, working happily. Tom was mending his ways, guided by the colonel's legacy. Mr. Clement led with kindness, his secret shared, and Mrs. Gray, her revenge undone, faced justice. As the meeting ended, the village glowed under a pink sunset. Miss Marple walked home, her stick tapping, the air sweet with roses. She thought of her garden, how it thrived through care. People were the same, flawed, tangled, but capable of blooming. The lavender, the clock, the letter, the note, all were threads in a tapestry now complete. At her cottage she sat by the fire, her knitting soft in her hands. "Motive and chance," she whispered, "weave a fine web, but wisdom cuts through." The flames danced, the village slept, and St. Mary Mead shone with harmony, its last thread tied by an old lady's gentle gaze.